Have you ever wondered what an extremely rich man, or a woman of almost limitless power, thinks in the last seconds before leaving this world? Not what they say in interviews, or what they leave written in wills, but what surfaces in their mind when there's nothing left to protect, conquer, or hide. That's a question almost no one can answer. Almost. In the early 20th century, a simple man from rural America began to attract worldwide attention. He was not a doctor, nor a priest, nor a politician. He worked as a photographer and lived a modest life. But he had something no university could teach: the ability to enter a deep trance state and, in doing so, answer questions that seemed to come from a place beyond our world. His name was Edgar Cayce, and over decades he left more than 14,000 records of these sessions, known as readings. Sick, lost, or desperate people came to him, and also people who wanted to understand life after death. What almost no one expected was that in these readings, Cayce not only described medical diagnoses or spiritual advice, but also reported messages coming from souls who had already departed. And among these voices were some who in life had occupied positions of wealth and power that few of us can even imagine. Imagine for a moment a magnate, accustomed to giving orders and being obeyed, now speaking no longer as Mr. So-and-so, but as a consciousness freed from the body, looking back and evaluating his own existence. There are no more mansions, no more bank accounts, and no noble titles. What remains? Cayce described these communications with simplicity, but also with a detail that made many listeners tremble. He said that for many of these spirits, the shock was profound. The idea that power would continue on the other side immediately collapsed. The first confession he heard from them? The belated recognition that they had invested their entire lives in what they could not take with them. There was a banker, for example, Cayce never revealed full names to preserve families, who, after dying, reportedly said, "I spent my days accumulating numbers, and now I realize that the numbers do not recognize me." This phrase was recorded as one of the most impactful because it carried a cruel detail. It wasn't just about losing money, but about realizing that one's personal worth had been confused with what one possessed. Another spirit, described as a former political leader, reportedly confessed to Cayce that his biggest mistake was believing that the love and loyalty he received came from his personality. "Now I see," he reportedly said, "that many followed me not for who I was, but for what I could offer, and when the power ended, they disappeared too." These stories began to circulate among Cayce's followers, and they sparked something curious. Ordinary people, without great fortunes, began to wonder if they weren't falling into the same trap, just on a smaller scale. After all, how many of us also confuse our worth with what we possess or the position we occupy? But there was something even more intriguing. Cayce said that some of these spirits were not at peace at the time of communication. On the contrary, they seemed confused, even regretful, as if they were still attached to earthly matters. He explained that the transition between the physical and spiritual planes could be slower for those who lived intensely tied to control, status, or material attachment. It was as if, in the absence of a body and a throne, they needed to relearn who they truly were. This view shocked those who believed that simply dying was enough to automatically be in a better place. According to Cayce, the state of mind at the time of death and the type of life one led greatly influenced the initial experience on the other side. A businessman obsessed with profits, for example, might find himself surrounded by images of contracts, vaults, and numbers, not because heaven was like that, but because his mind was still conditioned to that world. Do you perceive the weight of this? It is not an eternal condemnation, but it is a delay in the freedom that many hope to find. And this is where we begin to enter the most painful confessions. Some spirits revealed that in life they always knew, deep down, that they were neglecting relationships, health, and purpose. But they told themselves that one day they would take care of it. That one day never came. Cayce recorded phrases like, "I always thought there would be more time, and now time has run out." For those who heard, it was impossible not to be touched. These words came not as sermons, but as raw, unembellished accounts. They were like a warning, what you leave for later so may become the regret you carry to the other side. And it wasn't just regrets. Some spirits spoke about surprises. A millionaire reported, through Cayce, that at the moment of death he was greeted not by great figures of his social life, but by humble people he barely remembered helping. He said with astonishment, "Those who smiled at me for a small gesture were the first to receive me. They were not the high society men I thought I would find." This revelation later inspired many of Cayce's followers to reflect on whom, in fact, they were positively impacting in life. There is also a confession that Cayce described as one of the most beautiful. A former industrialist who built an empire of factories said that he discovered, outside the body, that every genuine act of kindness he had performed, even if small, created a kind of light that guided him, and that these lights combined were worth more than all the buildings and machines he left behind. But not everyone found light immediately. Some reported an emptiness, a kind of endless echo of their own ambitions, as if they were trapped in a hall of mirrors. Cayce explained that this was not punishment, but a reflection of one's inner state, and that, with time and an openness to new learning, even the most stubborn found a path to peace. And here lies the unsettling question. If these men and women, with all the power and wealth they possessed, confessed that true value was not where they imagined, what does that mean for us, who may still be chasing the same illusions? Let's continue on this journey, because the confessions that follow reveal not only regrets, but also secrets about what truly matters when the curtain of life closes. Among all the stories Cayce reported, there's a striking pattern. The more a person identified with what they possessed or controlled in life, the harder it seemed for them to accept the transition after death. He described cases where the spirit seemed to wander, trapped in memories, as if trying to keep alive an identity that no longer existed. A former conglomerate owner, for example, reportedly spent months, in spiritual time, reliving board meetings and signing contracts that no longer had any effect. It wasn't punishment, it was attachment. And this repeated until finally he realized he was merely mentally recreating a world that had ended. Cayce explained that this resistance stemmed from the inability to imagine a self without external achievements, as if without the crown, the person had no face. He also described something that intrigued those who listened. It wasn't just regret that marked these spirits, but the surprise of discovering that the true inheritance of a life wasn't measured in possessions, but in human connections and impacts left behind. A former powerful investor, accustomed to seeing people compete for his attention, reportedly confessed that, upon reaching the other side, he found none of those who called themselves his great friends. Instead, he found himself surrounded by humble figures, an employee he had helped keep his job during a crisis, a neighbor to whom he had brought medicine during a harsh winter, and even a dog he had rescued as a child. For him, this reception was disconcerting and at the same time profoundly moving. He said that at that moment he understood something he had never realized in life. A person's greatness is determined by the small, invisible acts they perform, not by the deeds celebrated in newspapers. There were also confessions about fear. Cayce recorded accounts of high-ranking men and women who, even after dying, felt an almost physical dread of losing control. They weren't talking about material possessions at this point, but about the fear of no longer being heard, of no longer having influence over anything. It was as if, for them, the silence on the other side was unbearable at first. One of them, described as the owner of a newspaper chain, reportedly said, "I spent my entire life shaping public opinion. Now I realize I can't even shape a single thought except my own." This phrase deeply moved those who heard it, as it exposed a simple truth. In the end, all we can command is ourselves. But not all confessions were laden with pain. Some revealed a liberation that only seemed possible after death. Cayce told of a woman, heir to one of the most influential families of the time, who had spent her life fulfilling social expectations. On the other side, as she described it, she felt an immense lightness, as if she had finally taken off a tight garment she had worn since birth. She said that for the first time, she could choose where to go and whom to be with, without fear of judgment or obligations. Her confession was not one of regret, but of surprise at having lived so long obeying rules that now seemed irrelevant. "I could have lived for myself much sooner," she said, "but I needed to die to understand that." What these accounts made clear was that, regardless of social position, everyone reached a point where the evaluation of life became inevitable. Cayce described this moment as a spiritual mirror, an experience in which a person reviews their entire life, not as a sequence of events, but as an energy field where every action and intention is recorded. He said that the rich and powerful were forced to look beyond awards and achievements and confront the consequences of how they had used or wasted the resources they had. There was no lawyer, advisor, or counselor to soften this review. It was direct and non-negotiable. Some felt proud of certain decisions, and this generated an immediate sense of peace. Others, however, realized they had used their influence for self-benefit, harming people or ignoring needs they could have met effortlessly. Cayce said that the impact of this was felt as a real weight, a density that made it difficult to advance to lighter states of consciousness. And curiously, it wasn't the number of mistakes that determined the weight, but the clarity with which the person understood what they could have done differently. The greater the lucidity, the stronger the desire to repair or compensate. He also reported that in some cases, these spirits asked permission to send messages to the living, not to leave material inheritances, but to try to correct relationships or inspire changes. A former industrialist reportedly insisted that Cayce warn his grandchildren that the inherited fortune was not a shield but a responsibility. He said, "If you use the money only for yourselves, you will discover too soon that you possess nothing real." These messages did not always reach their destination, as Cayce did not always have direct access to the families, but the records were preserved, and today they are seen as timeless warnings. What becomes almost inevitable when hearing these accounts is realizing that the pattern doesn't belong only to billionaires or leaders. On a smaller scale, anyone can be living with the same attachment, the same illusion of control, and the same postponement of important choices. Cayce, in his interpretations, emphasized this point. He would say, "Don't look at these men and women as if they are distant from you. Look at them as mirrors that magnify your own blind spots." This statement had a curious effect. Many left the sessions more reflective about their own routines, wondering if they too were sacrificing time, health, or relationships in exchange for something that, in the end, wouldn't go with them to the other side. Cayce himself did not act as a judge. He saw these accounts as opportunities for collective learning. He said that if a rich and powerful spirit was willing to admit mistakes and fragilities, it was because they had already begun their own process of growth after death. And that hearing this, while we are still alive, is a rare gift, a chance to adjust our course before it's too late. It's as if someone has returned from a distant journey to say, "Don't go down that path. It ends in a dead end." It's up to each of us to decide whether to take the warning seriously. The most intriguing thing is that, according to Cayce, some of these spirits would communicate again in different sessions, months or years later, to report how they were evolving. He said that many, after understanding their mistakes, began to act as guides for living people, trying to inspire subtle changes that could generate positive impacts in the world. It was as if, on the other side, they finally found a deeper meaning for the influence they had lost on Earth. Some even said that only after death had they learned the true art of leadership, not through power, but through silent example. And when you start to put these pieces together, an uncomfortable conclusion emerges. Perhaps power and wealth, which so many of us desire, are far more dangerous tests than we imagine. Tests that, if failed, not only leave marks in this life, but also prolong the journey in the afterlife. And if that's true, the question we need to ask ourselves now is how to avoid falling into the same trap that so many fell into before us. According to Cayce, this trap began almost invisibly. It didn't arise on the day a person signed their first multi-million-dollar contract or assumed a prominent position. It started much earlier in the first years of life, when one learned to associate personal worth with external achievements. He said that many of the rich and powerful spirits who sought him, or who communicated through him after death, had grown up hearing phrases like, "You need to be someone in life," or "Success is the only way to be respected." And, little by little, they internalized the idea that love, respect, and belonging would only come if they had more than others. This more could be money, influence, fame, but fundamentally it was always about validation. When the body died, this mental structure did not immediately disappear, and the spirit found itself trying to keep alive an identity based on achievements that no longer made sense. Cayce recounted that some were genuinely confused at first because they believed that, in the spiritual world, the prestige accumulated in life would automatically place them in a prominent position. When they realized that everyone was on the same level, and that what truly mattered was inner development, the shock could be painful. One case he described involved a renowned former politician who arrived on the other side expecting a reception with historical leaders. Instead, he found himself alone in a kind of neutral space, feeling only the weight of his own decisions. It was there that, according to Cayce, he realized he had never truly known himself. He had always been the role he played, but he didn't know who he was without the podium. Another impressive account was that of a transportation magnate who, at the moment of death, had an extremely vivid life review. He relived scenes from the past, but not just as an observer. He felt exactly what other people had felt in each situation. When he recalled mass layoffs he had ordered, he felt the anguish and despair of every employee who lost their job. When he remembered helping a community rebuild a road after a flood, he felt the collective gratitude, like a warmth that enveloped him. He described this experience to Cayce as the true math of life, where every act had a real weight, and the final balance was not measured in profits or losses, but in feelings that spread like waves. This type of experience seemed to Cayce to be the turning point for many spirits. It was when they began to understand that the true value of existence was not in how much one possessed, but in how much one had contributed to the collective well-being. He reported that some, upon understanding this, felt an intense desire to return to Earth, not to accumulate more, but to do things differently. However, this did not always happen immediately. Cayce said that the desire for reparation could lead to several incarnations, each offering opportunities to develop virtues that were neglected in previous lives, and there were also those who resisted learning, even after death. Cayce described that some spirits remained trapped in a kind of grey zone, reliving negotiations, planning strategies, as if they were certain that at some point someone would come to give them back control. This resistance could last a long time on the spiritual plane, but according to him, the law governing this reality was inflexible. Progress only began when there was humility to recognize that one is not defined by what one controls, but by what one is. It's interesting to note that not all rich and powerful individuals experience this difficulty. Cayce recorded cases of influential people who made a peaceful transition, precisely because they had already learned in life not to cling to public image or material possessions. He spoke, for example, of a philanthropist who, despite managing fortunes, lived simply and treated everyone as equals. Upon arriving on the other side, his experience was described as a walk home, without resistance or shock. This contrast made it clear that the problem was not in wealth itself, but in what one allowed it to do to one's identity. Another frequently appearing aspect was regret for neglected relationships. Many of these spirits confessed to Cayce that they had lost the opportunity to deeply know their children, partners, or even childhood friends. They had convinced themselves that they worked hard to give their family the best, but only after dying did they realize that the best was not what they bought, but the time they could have shared. A mining magnate reportedly said, "I gave gold, but I didn't give my ear, and now I realize that the only thing my children wanted was for me to listen to them." Cayce considered this type of confession one of the saddest, because it revealed that life's most valuable currency is time, and it is irrecoverable. The emotional impact of these accounts made many listeners, especially those who were still young, reflect on their own way of living. But the most striking effect, according to Cayce, was on middle-aged or older people who had already experienced enough losses and disappointments to understand that time runs faster than one imagines. For this audience, the spirit's confessions sounded like an urgent invitation to reevaluate priorities. He said that those who heard these stories could no longer claim ignorance. They either adjusted their course now or ran the risk of carrying the same regrets to the other side. One detail that few mention, but which Cayce clearly recorded, is that some of these spirits found after death a creative freedom they had never experienced in life. A former banker, for example, said that without the pressure of financial results, he rediscovered the joy of composing music, something he had abandoned in youth. Another, who had been a high-ranking military officer, reported that he now dedicated himself to studying astronomy, not out of obligation, but out of pure curiosity. These discoveries showed that, even after a lifetime dedicated to power, there was still room for self-rediscovery. However, the implicit lesson was clear. It would be much more enriching to explore these parts of oneself while still alive, when one can feel and act with the physical body. Cayce believed that listening to these confessions was not just an act of spiritual curiosity, but an opportunity for personal transformation. He insisted that it was not about looking at the rich and powerful with condemnation, but with empathy, understanding that we are all vulnerable to the same kind of blindness, and that if we can learn from their experiences now, we can prevent the same cycle from repeating with us. And perhaps the most provocative part of all this is that Cayce claimed the soul's inventory begins long before death. Every night as we sleep, parts of us already detach from the body and conduct partial life reviews, small samples of what the final review will be. He said that if we paid attention to the dreams and feelings we carry upon waking, we could identify areas of life that need urgent adjustments. For him, this was the true utility of the spirit's confessions, not just telling stories about what comes next, but using what was said to shape the now. And this leads us to an inevitable reflection. If you had to face this spiritual mirror Cayce spoke of today, what would you see reflected? And more importantly, what would you like to change before it's too late? Cayce always made it clear that the confessions of rich and powerful spirits were not just isolated accounts, but part of a universal pattern. They served as reminders that there is no spiritual immunity for those with more money, influence, or fame. On the contrary, these elements act as tests that can be passed or failed depending on how they are managed. And when he described the transition of these individuals to the other side, it became evident that the greater weight came not from financial or political defeats, but from ignored opportunities for human growth. Regret, Cayce said, was not centered on the times they lost, but on the times they could have done something significant and chose not to. One example he liked to tell involved a textile industry magnate. In life, this man built empires, employed thousands of people, and amassed fortunes that spanned generations. But when he died, and according to Cayce began his life review, he did not see the parade of factories or the honor ceremonies he had received. He saw, in painful detail, every moment when he could have been fairer with wages, more humane with working hours, more attentive to the basic needs of his employees. He told Cayce that the greatest pain was not what he did, but what he failed to do when it was within his power. I could have given more without losing anything, and I chose not to give. And now that choice is what haunts me most, he reportedly stated. Another striking case was that of a real estate businesswoman, known in life as a ruthless woman in business. Cayce reported that, upon crossing to the spiritual plane, she was surprised to find herself not in a place of power, but in a simple, almost humble environment, surrounded by people she barely remembered. These were families who, decades earlier, had been evicted from her properties. She didn't recognize them, but each of them carried a feeling she could clearly perceive: insecurity, anger, the pain of not having a home. For her, this experience was like walking down a long, narrow corridor, where each step forced her to face a different face, until she finally understood that this was not a punishment imposed, but a reflection of her own life. These experiences showed something Cayce emphasized: there is no escaping the harvest of one's own actions. On the spiritual plane, he said, there are no convincing excuses or narratives to protect one's image. There is only the naked truth of what one did, what one felt and what one caused in others. Therefore, he said, life on earth is a valuable training ground, because here we still have time and body to correct our course, ask for forgiveness, and create a positive impact. After death, it is possible to evolve, yes, but the process can be much slower and more painful when one no longer has hands to act directly in the physical world. Cayce also reported that among these confessions, there were revelations about what truly stays with a person after death. The spirits described that they did not take titles, inheritances, or trophies with them. They only took what they had learned, the quality of the relationships they cultivated, and the virtues they had managed to develop. It was as if each life were a school, and the final report card did not record the grades the world values, but those that often we spend our lives ignoring: patience, compassion, honesty, generosity, moral courage. And this, in itself, dismantled the illusion that material success is synonymous with existential success. It's interesting to note that for some of these spirits, death was not just the end of a stage, but the beginning of a different mission. Cayce said that several returned to act as spiritual guides, using their experience of trials and errors to inspire changes in living people. A former financier, for example, reportedly told him that he now dedicated himself to subtly influencing young entrepreneurs not to repeat his mistakes. "If I can prevent one of them from living as I lived, it's worth it," he reportedly said. This type of account revealed that even after death, there was the possibility of redeeming part of the past through service to others. But there were also those who recognized that they would need to return to Earth in new incarnations to continue the work of maturation. Cayce reported that some even consciously asked to be born into more humble conditions to learn lessons they ignored when they had abundance. For them, the absence of material wealth was not seen as punishment, but as a more propitious scenario for cultivating inner qualities. And this, according to Cayce, showed that spiritual evolution is a long process that spans several lives, but always maintains freedom of choice as a central element. These accounts also served a practical function for those who heard them. They served as an invitation to review one's own life more frequently and deeply. Cayce often proposed a simple exercise. Imagine that today was your last day, and ask yourself what you would have liked to have done differently. He believed that repeating this exercise regularly helped to realign priorities and reduce the gap between what we say we value and what we actually do. For him, this practice was like a vaccine against the belated regrets that so many spirits confessed. Ultimately, what one perceives when hearing these confessions is that they don't just talk about death. They talk mainly about how to live in a way that death is not a shock or a burden. They remind us that what we accumulate in our bank account may make life easier, but it doesn't define our true inheritance, and that the true measure of an existence is the good we manage to do with the resources, time, and energy we had. Cayce said that if we could keep this awareness alive while we are here, we would change not only our own lives, but also how we treat the world around us. That's why, at the end of these sessions, he often left listeners with a question that echoed long after the conversation ended. What will you take with you when you cross to the other side? Not as an accusatory challenge, but as an opportunity for reflection. Because if there's one thing the confessions of the rich and powerful make clear, it's that there's always time to change, until the last breath. But the sooner we start, the lighter the crossing will be. Thus, perhaps the greatest gift Cayce left us was not to predict the future or describe the invisible, but to offer a kind of emotional and moral map based on the experiences of those who had already lived everything and suddenly lost everything they thought mattered. A map that points not only to heaven or to the other side, but to a much more accessible and urgent place, awakened consciousness here and now. And, concluding these accounts, Cayce always reminded, you don't need to wait for death to discover what truly matters. You can make that discovery today, and by doing so you can avoid carrying to the afterlife the same regrets that so many came to confess. The question that remains is simple and direct. Will you?